Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, episode 11, Treat Different Customers Differently. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
In this episode, we're talking about essential number 5, personal, with help from our very special guest, Bridget Brennan, CEO of the strategic consultancy Female Factor, author of groundbreaking books, Why She Buys, the New Strategy for Reaching the World's Most Powerful Consumers, winning her business, how to transform the customer experience for the world's most powerful customers. We'll meet and chat with Bridget a little later in the episode. You know, Steve, it seems like only yesterday that someone handed me a copy of the Rogers and Pepper's The One-to-One Future. I remember that book so well. It just transformed the way I thought about marketing. Was that your jumping off point as well for this chapter as a strategic thinker?
It was, and I feel like that book was really ahead of its time. I remember reading it, and I think maybe I heard Martha Rogers speak at a conference, and I was all about trying to bring those principles to the job I had at the time. And a lot of the concepts really became part of the lexicon for me in the coming years. But it felt like for lots of years it was a dream that was just not possible. Well, in some cases, it wasn't possible for me to get support for pushing some of those things ahead. But even when I did, I felt like just couldn't cost effectively or efficiently make some of those things happen. So I think this idea of one-to-one marketing and personalization has certainly been around for quite some time. I think that book was written in the mid-90s, maybe. Yeah. It's really, though, only become more practical, I guess, in the last 5 or 10 years, maybe.
I had this great boss, Rob Shields, when I was doing CRM at Hudson's Bay, and we had like 8-9 million records. So it was a substantial kind of base to work from. And he used to talk about this process of going from mass marketing to gang tackling to one-to-one. And it's kind of the spectrum that we thought about. How do we get from point A to B? Given that we're in the 21st century and data is the new oil and powerful AI technologies are there, do you think mastering these concepts is still, I thought by this point, this is kind of like a theme, I thought by this point I'd see more relevancy in communications, but I'm not quite sure I'm seeing it.
I think it's a mixed bag. Certainly there are some companies that have made a lot of progress. My own experience has been that sometimes the more mass techniques, they just die more slowly than you might think. I remember trying to push some more personalized efforts, maybe, 15 years ago now. And we needed to get budget and resources to create the content for the more one-to-one sort of things, as well as create all these little models. And it wasn't a huge amount of effort, but it was enough that it had to come from something else. And the something else it came from was, were those things that were the big drivers of, or perceived big drivers of revenue. So if we took
a flyer or a TV ad,
take it out of the TV ad or take it out of this big general mailer, whatever. We know we're going to lose that revenue. How can you be sure you're going to make it up from these one-to-one tests? And the answer was you couldn't be sure. But so I think there's this kind of organizational resistance when you've got the pressures of the day-to-day business and numbers you've got to make to pushing in this direction. But I think certainly it's accelerated quite a lot because it's become a lot easier to execute these sort of programs, and just the power of the lowering the cost of storage and the ability to manipulate data more readily and leverage those insights is just way, way more advanced. So that one-to-one future that Don and Martha were looking at back in the 90s, I think conceptually was fantastic. It just has taken a couple of decades for the underlying foundations to be available.
A couple of decades in the invention, so to speak, of cloud computing, right? Because that, I think, you put all these things together and not have to buy, AS400 IBM supercomputers to host it. It does take it to that next level. Let's pivot our discussion a little bit around consumers. Like, you make this point that no customer wants to be average. And there's always this paradox, right? We want to feel like we're part, what Seth Godin would call it, a tribe. We want to feel like we're part of something, but we want to feel individuals. And it feels like that is a nice metaphor for this relevancy in one-to-one marketing. Do you think that that's so?
Well, what I often say is no customer wants to be average, but the real thing now is no customer has to be anymore. So I think you're right. There is this tension between a sense of belonging, not calling attention to yourself by being weird or or whatever. Like you don't want to create embarrassing situations for yourself generally. At the same time, you want to be seen as an individual and having points of differentiation and not just having to settle for what everybody else gets. So I think there's a psychological aspect of this that's pretty powerful. I think what's really different over the last several years is the ability for customers to solve this problem for themselves. We not again to get into a history lesson, but if you think about 20 years ago, if you wanted to find that really unique product or get something custom made, that was quite an effort just to find it, right? Now, you might be lucky if you're in a big city or something that there might be more options. But for the most part, to try to find something that's really special generally meant being disappointed or going to a super expensive store to find a really esoteric item. Now, with the internet, we could scour the globe to find unique products, the so-called long tail of distribution. So
and great sites like, and great sites like Jay Belowski's Uncommon Goods, right? This ability to pull creators together at a small scale, but give it a big B platform, right? Just a nice big platform where people can be individuals, but can do it together.
Well, yeah, and it's fantastic from a supplier perspective too, where if you just think, just to get outside of the retail business for a second, but if you think about the music business, right, there are all these artists that have been able to be found via YouTube, TikTok, whatever, because you can put an album together, put a song together, put a performance together, and maybe it's okay that only 8 people see it, but maybe those 8 people become 800, become 8,000, become 80,000, et cetera. So when you think about the way products and music and other kinds of creative things got to market pre-internet, there were just a lot of barriers to the supply side of the equation, much less consumers trying to be able or being successful at finding it in the first place, and then much less getting it delivered to you, even if you could find it.
Yeah. And one of our future guests, Mitch Joel, often talks about how the band Journey lost their great set of vocal cords, Steve Perry, and they found their new lead singer on YouTube, a guy who was just doing an act. But he had posted, and like it's the 8 right people who saw that video. And I guess that leads me to my next question is, in a roundabout way. You also make the point that businesses need to, and retailers need to understand who their targets are, and almost as importantly, who they are not. So talk to us about that a bit.
Yeah, at one level, this seems like such an obvious point, that understanding your target consumer, having a unique selling proposition, market brand positioning, all those kinds of things are what many of us have been taught over the years at our jobs or in school or what have you. And there's a gazillion marketing books written on it, right? But I will tell you the number of times that I'm talking to companies where they can't clearly define who the customer really is in a precise enough way. A lot of times it seems to be like their definition of who the target customer is people who buy stuff similar to what we make. Like that's about it.
Right. Or and have a pulse and or location somewhere and some gender.
Affluent soccer moms or something, and that's about it. Right. And maybe that worked in the past, but with the degree of competition and all these, the things we were just talking about, the ability for some pretty esoteric offerings to be out there, but even some of the bigger or getting bigger digitally native brands that are created by venture capitalists, and many of those brands go after the big dog in the industry and find a really interesting micro segment to exploit. And that really risks you're losing, maybe a small percentage of your revenue, but potentially your more profitable customers. So I think it's just so important to get real clarity on who the product or service is for. And to your point, that also means saying, okay, we're not going to worry about these other customers either because it's not for them at all, we're trying to do something really different. That's the competition's customer, or they're not our customer right now, that we're going to build this, what I sometimes call the obsessive core, but like the center of the bullseye, the minimally viable audience to get the product to the next level. And then hopefully, if you really, really are powerfully important to that set of customers, then you can kind of ratchet up to other levels over time. But I just see so many companies that spread themselves too thin because they don't have good clarity of who the target customer is.
And then the clarity of the relevancy in the message. I think back, we're now many episodes in, we've interviewed such interesting people. So I just continue to draw on what different people say. And just thinking back to Rashad Tabakawala, if you're too much story versus if you're too much data, and somehow you need to be in the center where you're relevant, I guess, really, it's spoken a different way. The center is relevance, right?
Yeah, I talk about this in the book as the relevancy imperative, and I try to make the joke that it sounds like it's a Jason Bourne novel. But again, this is one of these concepts which is not a new concept. It's obviously been important probably since the beginning of time for anybody selling anything to be relevant. What is different and really harkens back to the underlying premise of Remarkable Retail is that you have to operate at a higher level of relevancy because the consumer controls so much power and because there is this abundance of choice that has developed over the years. If you're not incredibly relevant, you probably don't even get noticed in the first place. You never even get on the radar screen of the customer because there's just too much noise. There's just too many other choices. And then even if you end up being relatively relevant, there are just constantly new competitors. There are people that are willing to discount. There are people that are willing to target their marketing messages in more precise ways. So for you to really build a moat around your business, as much as I hate that cliche, you have to be incredibly relevant down to, in some cases, a very more, it's more mass customized, I suppose, in practice, but, you try to get as close as you can to that one-to-one level.
Let's bring on our guest because we kind of take it. We've been talking about the consumer writ large, but what Bridget does is focus her efforts and teachings and books on one set of customers, one particularly important set of customers, women, and how business retail is still missing the mark. So let's have a listen to what she has to say about it.
Well, Michael and I are super excited to have Bridget Brennan join us on the podcast. So welcome, Bridget.
Great to be here.
So we always like to start out just by asking you if you could tell us a little about yourself and the work you do.
Well, thanks, Steve. I would say that I live and work on the front lines of female culture. I'm the founder and CEO of Female Factor, which is the leading consulting firm that's focused exclusively on the study of women consumers. And our mission at Female Factor is to bring the voices and perspective of women to the businesses that serve them. So our areas of focus are everything from market research and marketing strategy to customer experience design and sales education. So that's my CEO hat. I'm also a professional speaker on the subject of women consumers and have addressed audiences all over the world, which is a part of my work that I truly love. And lastly, I am an author of the books Why She Buys and Winning Her Business. And I've also written a popular blog for Forbes.com on the topic of marketing to women since 2012. And lastly, I cannot forget to share with you that I'm a member of the Vikings Women Advisory Board of the Minnesota Vikings NFL team, in case there are any Vikings fans listening.
Wow, those could be fighting words, but we'll try to steer clear of any of that kind of conflict. So, well, I'd love to just start out talking about your book, Why She Buys, which I think is 10 or 11 years old at this point. We were talking off mic, I had gone back in preparing for this to reread portions, and I was just blown away by how much amazing insight there is in there, and the case studies and the frameworks and just, so much great stuff for people to learn about the female shopper and put into practice. But maybe we could just start big picture. What was your motivation to write it?
Well, first of all, thank you for rereading it. I wrote it because gender was and still is a huge blind spot for many businesses. Women drive the majority of consumer spending across consumer industries, and yet they are still so often missing from the strategic decision making at the very companies that depend on their business for survival. And I was inspired to write it at the time because at that point in my career, I had witnessed so many companies launch products and campaigns into the marketplace that were targeted to women, and yet there were no women who had any significant input any step of the way, whether we're talking about R&D or product design or packaging or even the ad agency creative teams. So I propose in that book a very simple but provocative question, which is, women are your customers, but what are you actually doing about it?
It's interesting. Maybe just skip ahead real quickly. I'm curious, and maybe we can circle back to it, whether you think a lot has changed in the last 10 years or so or not.
Well, if you had asked me when I started my first Marketing to Women initiative in 2003, whether by 2020 we would still be stuck at only 7% of Fortune 500 CEOs being women, and that's about a record high right now, I would have been shocked. I would have thought after 17 years, we would have made a lot more progress in terms of women achieving the highest ranks in business. So while there has been undoubtedly a lot of progress made, it's still moving more slowly than I would have anticipated.
Bridget, on the other side of that conversation, I mean, you make the point that often when brands are marketing to women, they get many things fundamentally wrong. I mean, as you say, women, pick a number, 70, 80% are either of purchases are either made or influenced by women. You would think this would all be kind of figured out. This isn't new. Give us an example of what you think the examples are of a fundamentally wrong approach, and then B, some sense of why this isn't changing. Like, it's not a bolt of insight that women account for a tremendous amount of retail.
Well, I think that stereotypes are slow to die. And so I think stereotypes still can get in the way of a great customer experience. And I'll give you an everyday example. I was recently talking to a woman who actually owns her own retail business. She's the second generation owner of a family retail business. And she recently went to the bank to talk to a loan officer about getting more capital to expand the business. And as she sat down in the chair across the desk from the loan officer, she started to explain her business, what she wanted to use the money for. And he stopped her and said, wait a minute. Before you go any further, this is a second generation business and you're running it. Didn't your father have any sons?
Wow.
And, you think things like this happened 20 years ago or maybe are part and parcel of the Mad Men era. But It is still difficult for some people to reconcile that women can be CEOs, breadwinners, mothers, grandmothers, hard-charging executives all at once.
Vice presidents.
Yeah.
Right. As a vice president elect,
Sorry, vice president. I'm a little behind in my American politics, but yes.
Yes. And so we still see stereotypes trip up people in the marketplace when it comes to delivering great customer experiences, which is why my newest book, Winning Her Business, was focused specifically on the customer experience.
Well, let me chase that one down a little bit. So tell us about this new book, because what's interesting is as you're describing this environment of stereotypes, you talk about the Mad Men era. I mean, my goodness, that was in the 40, 50 years ago. You would think there'd be advisors, consultants, ad agencies who would be dialed in enough to kind of point these big firms in the right direction. But you clearly saw that there is more work to be done. And I guess that's part of the genesis of the book, Winning Her Business. Is that on target?
Yes, there are still so many shortcuts being made. The vast majority of business books are not written by women. The vast majority of companies are not run by women. So you end up with this gap that's often existing between management teams making high-level strategic bets and decisions and the customers that they are hoping will buy from them. And so in our work, Female Factor, and in my books, I trying to close this gap with insights and information. And, it's interesting to consider that here we are in 2020, near the end of 2020, and great customer experiences are still the exception and not the rule. And why is that? Especially when we've never had more ways to communicate with our customers. And because women drive the majority of consumer spending, they're often on the receiving end of most customer experiences, both good and bad. So my goal with Winning Her Business was to document, how do women define a great customer experience?
So, Bridget, I have maybe a broader question. This particular episode, and we're going to talk about other things outside the interview, is about being more personal and personalized. And do you think there's any criticism that's valid of saying, well, while there are obviously differences by gender, women, all the points you've made, women account for a lot of the purchases, that's too high a level of abstraction, that there's too many generalizations that are made if you apply that lens? What would be your response to that kind of pushback?
Well, I think that what we're really talking about is getting to know your customers and not stereotyping them. So I think we're actually talking about the opposite. And, when you spoke a few minutes ago about and asked me, what are some of the mistakes that are still being made? Well, one of my favorite things to say is that pink is not a strategy. But you still see pink and pastel being brought out to the market. Now it's not just pink, it can be pastels also, as something that is trying to pass for a marketing strategy. And, unless your company is trying to raise money for research into breast cancer, which of course is a wonderful and notable cause, it's best to consider pink as simply one color offering among many. And I truly believe that one day the glut of pink products will be looked back on as the first stage of manufacturers' response to the rising power of women.
Yeah.
Stage 1.0.
One thing that I found interesting, just in general, in a lot of business strategy, is companies seeming to do what's easy or effective, or efficient, but not effective. In other words, they just dumb things down, whether it's pointed towards women or pointing towards anything. Like, they just take the easy way out. It's kind of lazy marketing to do kind of batch blast and hope email marketing, for example, right? Because it's hard to be intensely relevant and to be more personalized and to really understand customers at a fine level to be able to deliver that better customer experience. How much of it do you think is lack of insight, bias, just laziness, just not willingness to dig deep?
Well, I think that in our society, we have a very short-term focus on a lot of different aspects of our society, including business. And so I think that, getting to know customers and getting the right insights work and doing the right market research, it takes time, it takes budget, it might take testing instead of just rolling something out, doing a beta test or a small test. And that takes up more time. And, people are in a hurry. And I think that they take shortcuts.
So help us understand, if we wanted to do this, not only, I guess, get past our bias or misconceptions or whatever, and really win women's business. What are some of the key ways to get started on that, or the things you think are most useful?
Well, I think some of the things that are most useful are starting at looking at the research you already have. A lot of people are swimming in data, and the challenge can be what to do with all that data. It can be very eye-opening to split your data by gender to see where the similarities and differences lie if you have that information. And it can be extremely informative to do gender-specific qualitative research. And again, looking for the similarities and the differences that can reveal opportunities. And then, of course, internally, striving for gender-balanced teams internally and with vendor partners, because multitudes of research show that diverse and gender-balanced teams achieve greater results. So it's not just the outside, but it's also the inside.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because I think that at least over the years, there have been a lot of efforts that I've been aware of or part of, or at companies I've worked for, pushing a diversity agenda. I think mainly because it's kind of like the right thing to do, or the noble thing to do, which I would agree it is. But I think one of the things that I got out of both your books is it's just really the smart thing to do. Like, it's not, you're not doing this for some broad do-gooder kind of philosophy. Certainly being fair and equitable to people is important, but there's also really, really tangible business benefits from pursuing this approach. So maybe that leads us to talking about this multiplier effect you talk about when it comes to focusing on women's business. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
Well, sure, Steve. The multiplier effect is all about the fact that when you earn the business and loyalty of one woman, you have the opportunity to reach everyone else in her household as well as her social business networks. Because in their role as primary caregiver and chief purchasing officer for the households, women are the gateway to other potential customers. And this multiplier effect, which I go through in detail throughout the book, Winning Her Business, has several dimensions, one of which is that women are huge drivers of word of mouth publicity for the brands and businesses that they believe in. And we all know that today, word of mouth publicity includes in a huge way social sharing online. And I like to say that women are the original social network. And if they have a great customer experience, they often feel that it's nothing less than their duty to pass on that valuable information to their friends.
It's so interesting. And let me ask you this question, just kind of picking up on some of the threads that you've been talking about. We spoke with Rashad Tabakawala, author, great author, a couple of episodes ago. And he said that brands, thanks to COVID, have what he called a 6-month mulligan, using a kind of golf term, that the first 6 months of 2021 can be that time to stretch, experiment, and do these things. If you were you and the listeners were listening to our conversation, what would you tell them that they should experiment with based on the work and the writing that you've done?
Well, first of all, I think we're seeing a lot of experimentation happening right now during the pandemic. And it's actually, a lot of it is really exciting. You know, there's nothing like a deadline that forces you to act. And the pandemic is a deadline that just keeps getting extended in terms of people coming up with new ways to serve customers. But I think that we have all the listeners, well-read folks I know, have been reading about how women have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in terms of their roles and responsibilities. And I think what's going to be interesting to see is how much more can we broaden the definition of convenience. What can convenience mean? How can we go beyond just, immediate delivery or curbside pickup? And in what other ways can we make it easier and frictionless for our very busy, stretched customers to work with us?
Yeah. Are there some examples in that regard? Well, maybe not just on the convenience dimension, but are there certain brands or organizations that you think do an especially good job of really understanding women and putting some of your ideas into practice?
Well, I think there's, when we talk with women about what are your favorite brands, we hear a lot of the same cast of characters. Great brands show up. For example, Target is one that we always hear about, and I think they stay very in tune with their customers. And, we've talked to a lot of women about how are your shopping habits changing since the pandemic? And they are changing utterly for so many people. One woman I remember, she said to me, Bridget, I am not the same person I was 6 months ago when it comes to shopping. She really felt like the trade-offs that she looked to make before the pandemic started, the trade-offs that she's making now, they're very different. How she's defining value, how she's defining convenience. And I think that the brands that stay very close to their customers and are evolving right alongside them are the ones that are going to come out in a strong position as the pandemic finishes.
Are there techniques, customer research, customer insight techniques that you think are particularly powerful that perhaps folks aren't aware of, or maybe are becoming more important during this time?
Well, I think that the interesting thing that the pandemic has shown us is how quickly the market can change and how much we might need to constantly have our fingers on the pulse of research instead of making it an annual or biannual or a once every 3 years big initiative. Yeah. We're seeing now speed to market is so important, and the research industry has been responding with all sorts of fantastic ways to use apps and use technology and have participants use their own phones to get real-time information. So it's become more important than ever. Technology has become more important than ever. But I think it always comes down to having that right balance of qualitative and quant, because the quant, we know, tells us the what, but the qual is often what tells us the why. And that can not only be revealing for the now, but also for planning for the future.
Sure. Well, actually, that's a good, this time has really gone by quickly. So I think we're getting to our last question here, but that's a good setup, because one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, and I get into this in my book a little bit, and we mentioned talking to Rashad Tabakawala a couple episodes ago. One of the places we went down was the importance of empathy in designing customer experiences. And to me, that's very much, it's kind of a left brain, right brain kind of thing. It's it's more qualitative, I guess you could say, than kind of the strict linear thinking. I'm curious, and I know you touched on this throughout the book a little bit, but how do you see the role of empathy in designing these remarkable customer experiences? And are there things that people get wrong in not applying empathy to the way they listen to customers and work on that customer insight part?
Well, I think we're living in a moment where we're all trying to have more empathy with others than we maybe ever had before, because we understand that our coworkers, our colleagues, our customers are in new territory. Many people, especially if they're balancing a job with children at home who are remote learning, or parents who might be not just balancing a job, but maybe looking for a job and balancing these types of activities. So I think we're all aware of how important empathy is now. Yeah. And empathy has always been critical to consumer insights. And I feel like this pandemic has opened the window in a huge way on how deep empathy can go. For example, I think it's going to be very interesting to watch how are homes redesigned after the pandemic is over? I remember working with a home builder we had as a client when the home office was the hot new amenity. Well, you don't just need one home office anymore. You need lots of places to work and multiple places for people to work. Maybe homes are not only going to be built with multiple workstations all over the place, but we're also seeing, apartment buildings being built with rooms to accept packages up in the front lobby that didn't used to exist. And so I think if we look at just even at a foundational level, like how are we going to change the spaces we live and work in, and root these changes in empathy, and then all the consumer products that we need around them will follow.
I think that makes a ton of sense. So I feel compelled to wrap up by reading a quotation that you reminded me of when you were talking about the appallingly low number of women that are in senior roles. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's from the late great Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She said, "When I'm sometimes asked when there will be enough women on the Supreme Court, and I say when there are 9, people are shocked. But there have been 9 men, and nobody's ever raised a question about that."
Oh, Steve, I love that quote. It's so eye-opening, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it so shifts your perspective. But anyway,
yeah. Steve, I would like to finish this up also with the thought. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is amazing. I'll just add my 2 cents.
Yeah, tough act to follow from a quote perspective.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
the notorious RBG. But I will say, when you provide what I call an inclusive customer experience for women, we find that it enhances the experience for every customer.
I love the conversation. I mean, it's really interesting, this idea of what I'd call role compression, right? As you're saying, the COVID crisis, the COVID era has brought upon not all of us equally, and this idea of role compression is really fundamental to 2021 and the post-COVID era for sure. Very interesting. Thank you, Bridget.
Thank you both.
All right. Well, listen, that was a great interview. I mean, again, we're 11 episodes in, and I continue to learn so much from everyone. And it really, as a guest, combining the thoughts around this idea of relevance and personalization, Bridget really took it to a different level, because she really just says, listen, all this time gone by, you're still missing the mark. It's right there, though, to be understood. And that's customize, even at the gang tackle sort of speak level, which is appropriate because she's a Vikings fan.
Yeah.
That you can get more relevant, but getting more one-to-one and more focused on treating customers differently, right?
Yeah, I think the whole idea of treating customers differently is, that I think can be applied at a pretty high level, as well as, and, obviously she makes this point around gender differences in particular. And then as you drill down into more particular cohort segments, whatever you want to call them, it's really appreciating those different needs, wants, and in some cases, the value of those customers. Because that's another thing that Peppers and Rogers talk about a lot in that one-to-one future, which is differentiating customers by their current and potential enterprise value. So there's all the work we need to do to be remarkable, to win, grow, keep their business. But we also have to be mindful of making money at some point. And in some cases, right, it's just, there's no profit potential because the customer just buys on deal all the time, returns a lot of product, whatever it might be, or just the cost to serve them is way too high. So we have to keep our eye on the prize there as well. And I think the more you delve into that customer data, the more, as we started to talk about at the end there, we understand maybe more the emotional side, the empathetic side, the story side. That often gives us some other things to be able to work on and to make more personal.
I love that last point, because I've got lots of examples in my background, I'm sure you do as well, where you delve into the data. And I guess this gets to this idea of being led by the data. We were looking when I was at the Shopping Channel, we were looking at returns, because returns is a big deal for, QVC, HSN style or catalogs. And sure enough, it was a Pareto's Law return issue, that a few people were returning outrageously high. But when we dug into the data, we kind of found out why and found solutions. And that's one simple example. But when you think about being data led as an organization, what do you think? Like, what does that mean to you on a day-to-day, year-to-year strategy perspective to be data led?
Well, I kind of like Forrester's got this little model, I guess, or maturity model that has the lowest level for an organization being data averse. The next level is data aware. The next level from that is data driven. And then the highest level is data led. And my experience has been a lot of organizations, there's pretty few organizations of any size today that probably are fundamentally data averse, but a lot sit in this data aware or data driven part. I think the distinction between being data led is that using analytics and the power of data is just really interwoven into everything you do. That you're much more confident about the decisions you make because you've pushed the data as far as it can go. In some cases, maybe you're using pretty advanced tools like AI and other things to inform your choices. The trick here, I think, so I think absolutely most organizations should be pushing to be data led. I think the trick is to try to bring in the art with the science, right? Is to get that balance, because
You still need a great merchant to list a great product, right? The data has to feed strategy, right?
Well, I think I think there is you can maybe, and I've worked on a lot of projects like this where you can get some pretty interesting findings through statistical analysis of data and things you just can't see that the machine can see, right? but the other way to approach it, and I think both can be equally valid, is to have this strategy overlay and have a hypothesis, and then see whether the data supports it. But there's very few businesses, I think, where you don't have some sort of intuitive component, or particularly in fashion and some other industries where the customer is going and where the industry is going is not necessarily going to emerge just from a data-focused strategy. You have to be able to interpret other kinds of signals, or as Bridget was getting at a little bit, listen in qualitative data for some nuggets that aren't purely a spreadsheet analysis or statistically derived, or the algorithm is not telling you what to go do. You have to take that as input, but apply other kind of judgment and creativity on top of it.
Well, I think there's never been a more important time for that judgment and creativity, because some ways consumer behavior has just and continues to undergo dramatic changes thanks to the COVID era. I mean, consumer change and behavior changes based on generations and what millennials, what Gen Zs do, but we've never quite seen this kind of circuit breaker. So I was speaking to one retailer, and he says, I don't know if the AI models are that reliable anymore, because they predict based on data from 2019, and
right.
Consumer behavior is just changing in ways we do and do not understand. So it's a really provocative idea that now more than ever, in one way, do you need to be data led, but at the same time, you also need to be with judgment to curation, just a great merchant to look at the data and understand the strategy, right?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful with, I'm certainly not an expert on AI and machine learning. Some of the companies I've worked with on that a little bit, the thing you learn about, or thing I've learned about what's going on today and in the very recent past, is there really aren't a lot of retailers that are applying the leading edge artificial intelligence, neural network kinds of stuff yet. There's a lot of applications for AI that either are routinizing work, so they're basically taking out labor because the machine's really good at providing certain rote tasks, or to what you were getting at, making pretty accurate predictions based upon past behavior. But when that past behavior pattern starts to break, the machine isn't smart enough yet to figure that out, or in very rare cases, as I understand it. So we need to be careful to not assume that some of this advanced technology is going to be able to predict in a way that, or in certain types of instances, that human beings happen to still be better at. And that's where creativity and empathy and some of these other things really come into play.
And it can be, I think, particularly gnarly because on the one hand, biases can creep their way into the programming.
Sure.
And then at the other end, the output end, people go, well, the computer said it, so it must be true. And we've seen examples of that socially.
Yep.
In other contexts where the AI has taken us, police forces, whoever, down a wrong path because of both of those things. And I think that, I don't want to end on a watch out note because I think, but I think what you're driving at is this judgment around prediction has never been more important. And I can't imagine being a remarkable retail is more important now than ever before, and being relevant to what is happening now and in the future is just, it's literally going to separate people who stay in business and thrive from those who will continue to struggle and maybe not be in business.
Yeah, I don't think that, it's probably trite to say that the world just keeps getting more complex, but I think it's true. And we've compressed so much change into a relatively short amount of time. We've got the retail playing field being reset in many cases, as Bridget alluded to. We've got consumer behavior that has changed, is probably changing permanently, but it's still hard to know how many of these behaviors will persist. So it's particularly complicated time. And the good news is we have a lot more tools at our disposal, I think, to be able to get closer to that one-to-one marketing. But there's still a lot of talent that has to be deployed and a lot of creativity to get these strategies right and not just kind of hand the keys to the robots and the algorithms.
And then it's Judgment Day. So why don't we leave it there? That's a wrap for this episode.
Kind of Judgment Day, I think, but...
Yeah, no kidding. Listen, thanks to our very special guest, Bridget Brennan, for joining us today. And Steve, why don't you read us out?
If you like what you heard, you can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Please rate and review, and be sure and recommend to a friend or colleague in the retail, brand, or CPG industry. I'm Steve Dennis. You can learn more about me on stephenpdennis.com, and be sure to check out my insights on LinkedIn and Twitter.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail podcast. You can learn more about me on meleblanc.co. Steve, have a safe week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Same to you.